example, in the early Middle Ages, and I'm talking really since the fall of Rome to just about the year 900 something, let's say up to the Norman conquest, okay? Something
Hmm.
like that. For a city to be properly ratified with a charter, it would most likely come from high above, not normally just nobles or clergymen, but it will have something to do with a development in the monarchic regime, or whoever is actually running the show, which, to be fair, for most cases in Europe, this is going to be a monarchy. That is because, remember that these early medieval cities are still trying to continue in the same trend that they did in Roman times, and a lot of these cities would have been fortified. So, for example, we know that the King Alfred the Great here in England, before the Norman conquest, actually made not necessarily charters as we know them a bit later on in the Middle Ages, but a lot of specific laws and things similar to charters for several towns for the sake of improving bureaucracy, administration, and to improve the network of burghs. Now, this is a very specific English case in that regards. The word burg is where we get borough and burg
Hmm.
from in English. But for Alfred the Great, the idea of these burgs, it was not just, for him to have some cities where people were going to live. It was also to create a network of enclaves where to have allies, where to have resources, where to seek shelter if the Norsemen arrived, right? So,
Right.
as you can see, it would have been 100% in his interest to say, oh, here is some stuff for Winchester, here is for Chichester, here is there and now for whatever might have been required. In fact, we know because of the way this was administered in England that when the Normans arrive and they see how cities and towns have been administered during, let's say, late Roman and Anglo-Saxon time, they are completely shocked because it makes no sense from the point of view of general, management of the kingdom. They need to locate a lot of sources, people, and whatnot. The Normans, in that regards, are a bit more strategic, right? A lot of their settlements are going to come alongside with either a church or a castle. So, as a result, the approach is going to have to be different. But we notice, for example, that in the early Middle Ages, it's a little bit, of a top down situation rather than a bottom up. The
Right. That makes
farther
sense.
in we get into, let's say, the 12th century and 13th century, it mostly comes from a mix of people and lords. Many settlements that were already, let's say, a lordly state, like, for example, the city of Carcassonne, right? We have the medieval city. We know that then La Bastide would be created because the people are kicked out. This wouldn't normally be something that would have happened before the high Middle Ages, really. It wouldn't have been logical for people to want to move to cities in abundance because during Roman times, this idea of cities was quite different. It might have been interesting for them to do so from the point of view of, military support and defense, but that's about it. So if you're a mostly agricultural society and you don't have any other trade to offer, why would you move to a city where there isn't necessarily not a market, if you see what I mean, before that
Hmm.
moment in time? So with the shift of the overall commercial development, it is then where we start seeing that, I guess, beneficial development for ordinary people to actually say, hey, you know what? Yes, I'm gonna go here and do some business, and for that, indeed, I will need a charter because otherwise, well, how am I gonna guarantee that my trading emporium is gonna survive, right? It's
Hmm.
it's entirely self-serving in that regards. Even if we're talking about the medieval communes, it is self-serving because it is to gain some form of independence, allegedly democratically, but also to gain some sense of coalition against a bigger threat, like it could be, the king or whatever. But even from the point of view of the monarchy, sometimes it was simply just interesting to grant these rights, again, for self-serving reasons. Cool, we have some merchants here. Let's face it, if we don't give them something, we're not going to be able to see a penny of that taxation. Awesome. Here you go. Go build whatever you want. Give me however much percent every year. Because otherwise, how is the monarchy going to make money? If you see what I mean. The vast
Mhm.
majority of countries in Europe during the Middle Ages make money through taxation
Mhm.
or homage or duties. There is only so much you can squeeze out of people in a feudal
Mhm.
situation. So if now you're going to provide me with goods that I can take money out of, sweet.
Yeah.
So it is that kind of strange mix. But I would definitely say, the early Middle Ages work on a slightly different way. The High Middle Ages is where we start really seeing people doing it from their own perspective. And then kind of the whole situation flips on its own back again, because the farther we go into the later Middle Ages, particularly the closer we're getting to the year 1500, is that desire for centralization that actually really pushes the monarchy and people higher above to create cities again for their own agendas, normally for the development of specific trade goods, administration, elites in areas that is convenient for them. You could definitely, I think, say that we kind of go full circle in some ways. And it will kind of continue that way pretty much until we start experiencing some of the, let's say, more elaborate revolutions in Europe in early modern times. With the wars of religion, things will get really out of hand. People will start thinking about what those city privileges gives them once again, and how they will fight for city privileges. It will also, after the Middle Ages, will become a matter of survival, really, because of the constant state of war, but this time with cannons and gunpowder.
Mhm.
It's not the same being sieged by a trebuchet and an army of 20,000 knights and their retainers than, well, the barrage of constant
Mhm.
death incarnate by cannons. So the let's say that the breakage of that pattern really comes after our time period, but still keeping in mind some of those triangulations. Then, like I was saying, some geographical areas are a little bit more complicated than others. We saw the example of Spain last week of, those villas, and how a villa is not always a city, but if a city wants to be a city, it needs a charter and to be a villa beforehand. So, it gets convoluted. And yet in Spain, the entire point of making those cities, more often than not, is the idea of cultural supremacy, because culture does not accumulate in the countryside, if you see what I mean. Peasants don't tend to be very well educated. They don't have to be luxury goods. They don't have access to, you know, a good education, etc., etc., or at least not at an extensive, um, let's say, level. So the more and more processes like the Reconquista happens, or the infighting between the different factions of Spain, the more and more it is the people above, whether it's nobility, royalty, or indeed the church and different versions of the church, that will want to promote these cities for those cultural wars. In Spain, is very obvious that those cultural wars happen. We have well, I say this with caution, because the evidence are a little bit tepid. We have, to some extent, a similar situation in the Balkans and in Eastern Europe. If we're looking at places like uh, Romania, Transylvania, Wallachia, sort of down to Bulgaria, and maybe as far down as on the opposite side, as, let's say, Albania and places that were constantly, in a very delicate situation, we do get this kind of strategic desire to build cities, both on behalf of the citizens for protection, on behalf of the powers above, for other reasons, not just trade. As we start seeing the advances of the Golden Horde and the Mongols, from the east, uh, the countryside is ravaged. You don't stand a chance if you see the idea here, at least in a city. Even though it would be tough, you could maybe take your chances. It's the same the farther or closer we get to Byzantium, after the Fourth Crusade, and considering how Byzantium had already not been doing so good since the ransack of Constantinople, controlling those areas through culture and through patronage via cities becomes more and more appealing, but mostly for those in power. Now, of course, those in power in some of these, let's say, liminal spaces in Europe are not necessarily, kings, or let's say a centralized state like we see with the Holy Roman Empire, or, in Poland or England or France, whatever. We're talking sometimes of suzerains, of, petty chieftains trying to carve their own slice of pie, and therefore utilizing these cities as a kind of a little emblem, a badge of honor of, hey, look at the little thing that I did, more than anything else. So ironically, the farther away we go from Central and Western Europe, the closer we get to the edge, and the closer we get to Europe being in contact with other civilizations, for good or bad, the more that pattern of the reasons why becomes malleable. Does that make some sense? Normally, if you were a citizen, and this is something we need to understand, not every single person that lives in a city is a citizen. There are, again, all animals are equal, but some animals are more equal than others. The different cities have a different way of applying these tolls, or the exact amount. The vast majority of the time, the idea was that anybody coming into the city, for any capital gain, or for prolonged time living there, ought to pay, because that was their dues. They were paying for the privilege, because at the end of the day, somebody was going to collect taxes from the city, and if you're just coming here and enjoying it as a freebie, well, not necessarily going to work. And it was actually, we know from the records of most cities, that this was enforced normally, pretty heavily, because cities were so dependent on it. I don't know if I've mentioned this before, but here in the city that I live in the UK, in the city of Southampton, and it was actually similar enough in Winchester in the Middle Ages. Southampton didn't have proper city walls until the Hundred Years' War. It's the result of the Hundred Years' War, actually. Southampton was a very small town at the time, maybe a population of about 2,000 inhabitants. It had palisades from Norman times, but during the Hundred Years' War, because it was the key port of Winchester, it gets completely ransacked, and the mayor of the city essentially goes and asks the king, hey, can we please put some city walls up so that we don't die? Because again, you couldn't just go doing these things without those permissions. And Southampton was, technically speaking, not given the actual title of city until actually the 60s. So we had a settlement, we had an urban enclave, but it didn't have the rights of the city of Winchester just up the road, if you see what I mean. So they kind of had to ask for all of these bits and pieces, and therefore every single bit of privilege that they got was taken in a very precious way. So once the city walls went up, we actually have a pretty big section of them still being kept alive, but the key, let's say, entrance to the city that we call the bar gate, It's actually called the bar gate because, well, here in this town, we're pretty straightforward. It's a huge medieval gate. I was just looking on my computer to see if I have a photo of it handy, but I don't think I do. It's a huge gate, 100% typical 14th century architecture, very thick because it was a maritime defense at the same time than the city walls in that regards. And we call it the bar gate because you can still see it very clearly nowadays, not just where the portcullis was, but a massive bar of wood that would go across the door and would not be lifted unless you paid to come in. And if you gave any trouble, Southampton actively put their prison above the bar gate so that, if you refuse to pay, they will literally shackle you up, send you upstairs, think about what you've done. And if you didn't want to cooperate, there is a very clear area as you're going in that used to be a trap door. Why on earth would you have a trap door from a, building at top if it wasn't for public executions? So while I cannot say that every single town was, perfect at chasing these kind of misbehaviors and misdemeanors in relation to tax collection and those kind of tolls, most of them, for that specific reason, were pretty hot on the subject. It was actually one of the main reasons why the city guard or the urban militia was kept around to avoid general public violence, but also to enforce that the money was going to who it was supposed to be going to, rather than, evading in that regards. There were some other cities that were a bit kinder and that kind of allowed you to go in and, willingly register yourself at the city council and pay there. But like I said, it very much depends on town to town. And most towns, particularly at the beginning, because at the end of the day, these were uncertain times, they didn't take any chances. You are here at the door, so are we. So let's make business straightforward. You want to come in? Awesome. Give us your share and off you go. Then, of course, some people didn't have to pay because they have safe conducts or whatever. And it's also one of the other reasons why cities had more than one entrance. We often think that was purely for defense or for the flow of people. But again, Southampton is a very good example. On the east northeastern side of the city, where the city walls no longer remain because they were destroyed for urban planning in the 19th century. There was a smaller gate, and I'm talking literally like my home entrance would be as big as it, um, that had slightly different rules because that gate was used by monks that used to live in a friary that existed just outside of Southampton. And before the city walls had gone up, the friary was technically, part of the urban landscape of Southampton. But when the walls go up, they are alienated from the community. And these were Franciscan friars, which also had a hospital. So both of the sake, for the sake of citizens that may need access to the hospital, because Southampton indoors didn't have one until much later. And for the sake of those friars that sometimes had to actually, conduct business in the city, a special gate was actually created for them to be able to go back and forth without having to go through the intricacies of the bar gate. It was still guarded because, if bandits or people getting up to any funny business caught wind of it, they would try, if you see what I mean, to go through the other end. But there is a lot more to the way that cities were created, in terms of not just fortifications but points of control of people, precisely because of that, to be able to have flexibility for those that need that flexibility and to be able to enforce things properly in a much more rotund way.